My name is Mildred Havers, and the night the hurricane struck our town was the night my life and my family changed forever. You might actually regret missing out on this dramatic story. So before you sit down and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. The local news anchor's voice cracked as she repeated the same warning over and over. Residents in low-lying areas must evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. The screen flashed with images of surging waves and howling winds. My fingers tightened around my teacup as I stared at the television, the glow of the screen reflecting off the darkened window beside me. I had lived alone in this little house for nearly a decade, and while storms weren't new to us, something about this one felt different. The air was heavier, as if it carried both the weight of the coming disaster and the ghosts of my past. I turned off the TV and stood at the window. The sky looked bruised and furious clouds swirling like restless beasts. The trees in my yard bent and shivered under the strengthening wind. I thought about what I needed to do: flashlights, candles, bottled water. My movements were calm, practiced, but my mind wouldn't stop wandering backward. I remembered when storms used to mean my husband and I would bring the children into the living room, light candles, and tell stories while we waited for the power to come back. We'd laugh at his terrible shadow puppets on the wall. Those memories felt like they belonged to another lifetime and to another woman, a woman who still had a family around her. I passed the mantel, my eyes catching on the dust-covered frames. My son Andrew at his college graduation, his smile proud and bright. My daughter Rebecca on her wedding day, her face glowing with joy. My throat tightened as I reached out, fingers brushing the edge of Rebecca's photo. We hadn't spoken since that night. Harsh words, misunderstandings, and wounds too deep for either of us to face. Andrew had followed her lead. Slowly, they had both drifted away, leaving me with unanswered calls, unopened letters, and a quiet house that no longer felt like home. By nightfall, the wind had picked up to a terrifying howl. The first heavy drops of rain smacked against the windows. Then, in an instant, the lights flickered and went out. I stood there in the dark, listening to the eerie sound of the storm building its rage. I lit a few candles, their warm glow spilling across the photographs, like fragile reminders of the life I once had. I made myself a cup of tea on the gas stove, trying to steady my trembling hands. The house groaned under the force of the wind, and branches scraped against the siding. My thoughts turned unbidden to Andrew and Rebecca. Were they safe? Did they remember me at all tonight? For years, pride had kept me silent. Pride and fear. Fear of being rejected again. I told myself I didn't care anymore, but that was a lie I carried like armor. A sudden knock at the door jolted me so violently that my teacup rattled in its saucer. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. No one visited me unannounced. No one ever came here anymore. The storm howled louder as I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the door. The porch light was out, but the beam of my flashlight caught the shape of a man standing there, drenched and shivering. My breath caught as our eyes met. It was Andrew, my son. His hair clung to his forehead, his clothes plastered to his body from the rain. He looked older, wearier, his face lined with the life he'd lived without me. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. The storm roared around us, but it felt like the world had gone silent. Slowly, I stepped aside. "Come in," I whispered, my voice breaking as I said his name for the first time in years. He stepped inside without a word, leaving puddles of rainwater on the hardwood floor. I handed him a towel from the hallway closet, my hands shaking. "The storm? It's worse than they said," he murmured. I nodded, unable to speak. The weight of everything unsaid hung between us like the storm clouds outside. I busied myself in the kitchen, heating a pot of soup on the gas stove. My heart pounded with every clink of the spoon against the pot. When I placed a steaming bowl in front of him, he looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and regret that nearly undid me. We ate in silence, the wind shrieking like a wounded animal outside. Finally, he set down his spoon. "Mom, I didn't know where else to go." His voice cracked on the last word. "Everything's flooding. The roads are closing." Before I could respond, a second knock echoed through the house, louder, more urgent. My son and I exchanged startled glances. My heart raced as I opened the door. There, soaked to the bone, stood Rebecca, my daughter. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her arms held two small, terrified children. For the first time in more than 10 years, all three generations of my family were under one roof, again brought together not by choice, but by the storm that none of us could have predicted. The sound of the wind roared as Rebecca stepped inside, clutching her two children close. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her clothes were soaked through. The children, my grandchildren, though they barely knew me, stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. I reached for a blanket draped over the couch and handed it to her. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her eyes flicked around the room, landing briefly on Andrew before dropping to the floor. The tension in the room was almost unbearable, decades of silence pressing down on all of us, like the storm raging outside. I shut the door and slid the deadbolt into place, as if that simple act could keep out both the hurricane and the ghosts of our past. "Come sit by the fire," I said softly, gesturing toward the small gas heater I had managed to start just before the power went out. The children huddled together on the rug, their small faces illuminated by the flickering glow. I grabbed a towel and gently dabbed at their wet hair. They didn't resist, but they didn't smile either. Why would they? To them, I was just an old woman they'd never truly known. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on his bowl of soup. Rebecca lowered herself into a chair across from him. Neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees and the occasional crack of thunder. It was surreal, my two children, who hadn't spoken to me in years, now sitting in my home, as if time had folded in on itself. I busied myself with making more soup, ladling it into bowls and setting them on the table. "Eat," I said gently, my voice shaking. Rebecca hesitated before taking a small sip. When I finally sat down, I looked at them, really looked at them. Andrew's face was leaner than I remembered, his eyes carrying a heaviness I hadn't seen before. Rebecca looked exhausted, her features softer but worn down in a way that spoke of years I hadn't been there to witness. The silence stretched on, unbearable and loud. Finally, Andrew broke it. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice low. "Everything's underwater. The roads, there's no way out." Rebecca nodded, glancing at him, but not at me. "The evacuation routes were flooded. We barely made it out of the car." She pulled the children closer, as if afraid the storm might still snatch them away. I felt a pang deep in my chest. For so long I had imagined this moment, us sitting together again, but never like this. Not with fear etched into their faces, not with so much unsaid between us. The house groaned as the wind battered against it. Rain pelted the windows so hard I worried they would break. A branch scraped across the roof with a screech that made us all flinch. I stood and began lighting more candles, their small flames scattering light across the room. "Remember when the power used to go out?" I said quietly, surprising myself with the words. "Your father would pull out that old board game and you two would argue over who cheated more." For the first time that night, Andrew let out a small, surprised laugh. It was a hollow sound, but it was something. Rebecca's lips twitched as if she might smile, but she looked away before she could. The moment passed, but it left behind a fragile thread, one that felt dangerously close to snapping, but also like the beginning of something I hadn't dared hope for in years. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Inside, my children and I sat in heavy silence, sharing a meal by candlelight, trapped not only by the hurricane but by the memories that still haunted us. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know if this fragile reunion would survive beyond the storm. But for the first time in a decade, they were here. And maybe that was the beginning of something we all needed, whether we wanted to admit it or not. As the night deepened, the storm outside became a living thing, howling, clawing at the house, shaking it as though it might rip the walls apart. The candles flickered wildly, their fragile light casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls as I sat there watching my children, grown adults now, quietly tending to their own thoughts. The silence was suffocating. It wasn't just the storm that pressed down on us. It was the years, 10 long years of pride, misunderstandings, and hurt feelings left to rot in the dark. My chest ached with the weight of it. My eyes drifted to Rebecca. She sat with her children curled up beside her, their small faces turned toward her for comfort. She smoothed back her daughter's damp hair, whispering something soft that I couldn't hear. The sight brought back a flood of memories, Rebecca, as a little girl with scraped knees and wild curls running to me for comfort after some playground mishap. I could still hear her little voice calling Mama fix it. But there were things I couldn't fix. Not then. Not now. It all came back to that night. Her wedding night. The last night we'd spoken without venom. I had said something I'd meant as advice, but it had come out wrong. She had accused me of trying to control her life, of never being proud of her choices. Andrew had stepped in defending her, and then it had escalated. Sharp words, pointed accusations, old wounds ripped open. By the time the night ended, both of my children had turned their backs on me. I had watched them leave, believing it was temporary, believing that they would call, that we would mend things with time. But days turned to months and months to years. My calls went unanswered. My letters returned unopened. Pride built its walls higher and higher until none of us could see over them anymore. A sharp crash outside jolted me from my thoughts. A tree branch had slammed against the roof. The children whimpered, and Rebecca held them closer. Andrew looked at me for the first time that night. Really looked at me. "Do you still have that old radio?" he asked, his voice a little steadier now. I nodded and retrieved it from the shelf. The static-filled voice of a reporter came through. "Conditions worsening. Flash floods in multiple areas. Roads are impassable. Residents are advised to shelter in place until further notice." Rebecca's lips pressed into a tight line. "I thought we'd be safe at the community center," she said softly. "But when the water started rising, we had to leave." The car barely made it through. I wanted to reach out to touch her hand, to tell her that I was glad she had come, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I poured her a bowl of soup and placed it in front of her. For a moment, she looked at me almost as if she wanted to say something, but then her eyes dropped to the bowl. Andrew cleared his throat. I didn't plan to come here either," he admitted. "I thought I'd stay with a friend, but his house is underwater. I just didn't know where else to go." The honesty in his voice broke something in me. For so many years, I had imagined this moment, imagined them knocking on my door, imagined the apology that would follow. But there was no apology, just exhaustion, fear, survival. Still, they were here, and that had to mean something. The wind outside shrieked again, and the house groaned under the force of it. I began lighting more candles, setting them carefully around the room. As the light grew, the tension seemed to ease just a fraction. "Remember the blizzard of '92? I said quietly. My voice was tentative, unsure. "We were stuck inside for 3 days. Your father made pancakes for dinner every night." Andrew smiled faintly, looking down at his hands. "Yeah," he said softly. "He burned every single one, but we ate them anyway." Rebecca let out a sound, half laugh, half sigh. For a brief second, her eyes met mine, and something unspoken passed between us. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. As the night wore on, I found myself moving through the house, gathering extra blankets, pillows, and candles. I watched as Andrew helped his niece build a little fort out of blankets in the corner, his once stern expression softening as she giggled. Rebecca caught me watching and looked away, her face unreadable. But there was no anger in her eyes anymore, just exhaustion, and maybe relief. The storm outside had trapped us together. We had no choice but to share space, share food, share silence. And though none of us would admit it, that night was the closest we had been in years. The wind outside screamed like a freight train, rattling the windows and shaking the very walls of the house. I could hear branches snapping, debris clattering against the siding, and the distant wail of an emergency siren carried by the storm. The power had been out for hours now, and the flickering candles were our only source of light. Their glow softened the room, casting long shadows across the faces of my children and grandchildren. It was surreal, almost dreamlike, seeing them here after so many years, sharing my space once more, even if no one knew quite what to say. I sat in my favorite armchair, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders for warmth. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the years apart had made it foreign to them. Andrew leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, staring into the middle distance. Rebecca sat on the couch with her children nestled close, whispering reassurances to calm their frightened hearts. I watched her lips move, the tenderness in her eyes unmistakable. It stung a little seeing her be such a loving mother when I had missed so much of it. The soft scratch of candlelight against the photo frames on the mantel caught my attention. There we were. Birthdays, graduations, weddings, all moments that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. My eyes settled on one picture in particular. It was the last photo we'd ever taken together as a family just a few weeks before the fight that tore us apart. We looked happy then. It was the kind of happiness I had thought would last forever. I stood slowly and crossed to the bookshelf, pulling out a worn wooden box from the bottom shelf. I set it on the table and opened it. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some written by me, others by my husband before he passed away. Letters to our children. Letters that had never been read. I traced my fingers over the envelopes, feeling their edges as though they might somehow bridge the years of silence. Rebecca looked up. "What's that?" she asked softly. "Letters," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. "Ones I wrote after you left." The room fell into silence again, heavier this time. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I picked up one of the letters, the paper yellowed with age, and carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky. This one had been written by my husband not long before his death. My throat tightened as I began to read aloud. "Dear Rebecca and Andrew, your mother and I are proud of you. We don't say it enough, but we are. No matter what happens, we'll always love you. Don't let anger win. Life is too short for that." My voice broke and I had to stop. The room was silent except for the howling wind outside. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her hand tightening around her daughter's shoulder. Andrew stared at the table, his jaw clenched. "I found these when I was cleaning out his desk," I explained, folding the letter carefully and placing it back in the box. "I wrote my own too. But I never sent them. I didn't know if you'd even read them." Rebecca opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The words wouldn't come. Instead, I lit another candle and placed it on the table. Its warm glow seemed to chase away some of the darkness that lingered between us. "I kept hoping you'd come back," I admitted softly. "Even after all this time, I always hoped." Andrew finally looked at me, his eyes heavy with guilt. But he said nothing. The storm raged on, shaking the roof and rattling the windows. I poured more soup into their bowls, silently grateful I'd stocked up on non-perishables long ago. Rebecca accepted hers with a quiet, "Thank you," her voice barely audible. As we ate in silence, I caught glimpses of my children stealing looks at one another. It was subtle, hesitant glances, fleeting as candle shadows. But it was there. A tiny shift, imperceptible but real. Later, I found Rebecca standing by the window, staring out at the storm. Her face was pale in the candlelight, her eyes distant. "It's strange," she murmured. "We ran here because it was the closest safe place. I didn't even think about it, I just drove." My heart clenched at her words. For years I had told myself they didn't need me, that I wasn't part of their lives anymore. But when disaster struck, when the world felt dangerous and uncertain, they had come here. To me. I stepped closer, my hand hovering in the air for a moment before I finally placed it on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. "I'm glad you did," I said softly. For the first time in years, she looked at me not with anger or resentment, but with something that looked achingly close to relief. And just like that, something inside me shifted. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was hope. A fragile hope, like a candle flame in the storm. Small, trembling, but stubbornly alive. The storm showed no signs of relenting. The house moaned under the force of the wind, and the rain lashed against the windows like an unending barrage of pebbles. It was well past midnight, but none of us could sleep. The children dozed fitfully under the blankets, occasionally stirring when the thunder cracked too loudly. I sat in my armchair, staring into the flickering candlelight, my hands clasped tightly together. I couldn't stop stealing glances at Andrew and Rebecca. My son sat near the heater, rubbing his hands together for warmth. Rebecca was on the couch, her head leaning against the wall, her eyes half closed, but never truly resting. The exhaustion was etched on her face, but there was still that same tightness around her mouth that told me she was holding back more than just words. The air inside felt thick with everything unspoken, the weight of 10 years pressing down on us as tangibly as the storm itself. My heart ached with the things I wanted to say, apologies, questions, memories I longed to share. But every time I opened my mouth, the words died in my throat. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the house. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding. The sound had come from the back door. Andrew was already moving flashlight in hand as he motioned for me to stay back. "It's just the wind," he said, after a moment peering out the window. A trash bin or something must have hit the steps. Still, we all remained tense. The storm made the world unpredictable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything familiar was being ripped away piece by piece. It was then, just as Andrew sat back down, that the next knock came. A firm, hurried pounding at the front door. We froze. Another knock. My stomach tightened as I rose to answer. When I opened the door, rain and wind blasted into the room, nearly blowing out the candles. And there she was, Rebecca, my daughter. Except now, she wasn't the young bride I remembered from the last night we had spoken. Her face was older, lined with worry, her hair plastered to her cheeks from the rain, and clutching her hands were two small children, my grandchildren. Children who barely knew I existed. Her eyes widened as she met mine. For a moment, we simply stared at each other, the storm screaming around us. "Mom," she said softly, her voice hoarse. "Get inside," I whispered, stepping aside. She ushered the children in, quickly, shaking from head to toe. Andrew had stood up now, staring at her with something between shock and disbelief. "Becca," he said, his voice low. She didn't respond. She simply knelt down to take off the children's wet shoes, murmuring to them as she worked. The tension in the room was unbearable, like a rope pulled too tight. My chest ached with all the things I wanted to say, how much I'd missed her, how many nights I'd hoped she would come back. But I said nothing. I grabbed a blanket and draped it over her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered, glancing up at me for just a second before looking away again. I poured her a bowl of soup, set it on the table. She hesitated before sitting down. The children clung to her side, too nervous to touch the food at first, until Andrew quietly pushed his bowl toward them with a small, encouraging smile. It was such a simple gesture, one brother to his niece and nephew, and yet it broke something in me. For so many years, I had convinced myself that this day would never come, that the wedge between us had grown too deep, too permanent. But here they were in my home, eating at my table, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to. I could feel the storm outside tearing through the world we knew, but in that moment I realized that maybe it had also torn down the walls we had built inside ourselves. Rebecca sat in silence for a long time before finally glancing at Andrew. "I didn't think you'd be here," she murmured. "Didn't think you'd be here either," he said, not unkindly. Their eyes met just for a second. There was no smile, no softening. But there was recognition, a flicker of shared understanding that hadn't been there for years. I stayed quiet, letting them have the moment. My heart was a fragile thing, then beating painfully in my chest. Outside, the wind howled louder and the rain pounded harder. But inside, something had shifted. Something small. Something tentative. We were no longer just three people surviving a storm. For the first time in 10 years, we were a family sharing a table again. The storm continued to rage, as if determined to remind us that we were at its mercy. The house shook with each powerful gust of wind, and the rain sounded like 1,000 tiny fists pounding against the walls. We were trapped together, and in that small living room, time felt suspended. Andrew sat at the table, shoulders hunched absently, turning his empty soup spoon in his hands. Rebecca leaned against the couch, her children nestled under each arm. They had fallen asleep, their soft breathing a quiet contrast to the chaos outside. I studied my children in the flickering candlelight. How had we ended up here, so broken, so far apart for so long? Memories of our last fight flashed through my mind, the shouting, the accusations, the sting of words spoken in anger. I had told Rebecca she was rushing into marriage without thinking it through. She had called me controlling, unable to let go. Andrew, protective as always, had taken her side. That night, they both walked out. Afterward, I told myself I wouldn't be the one to beg them to come back. I waited for them to call, thinking time would heal it. But time became distance, and distance became silence. Mom, Andrew said suddenly, his voice low. You kept the house the same. I blinked at him, caught off guard. I didn't see a reason to change it. His gaze swept the room. The same curtains, the same photo frames, the same old rug that had been here since they were teenagers. Something softened in his expression, though he quickly looked away. Rebecca reached for her bowl of soup, taking a small sip. Then she set it down and said almost to herself, I didn't think I'd ever be back here. There was no bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion. Neither did I admitted. My words felt heavy, vulnerable. The silence stretched again. It wasn't the brittle, angry silence of years past. It was something different. Something filled with all the things we didn't know how to say. I stood and began clearing the bowls, more for something to do than out of necessity. There's still bread in the pantry if anyone wants more, I said softly. No thank you, Rebecca murmured, her eyes distant. Andrew's voice broke the quiet once more. Do you remember that storm back in '96? The one that knocked out power for 2 days? I let out a surprised laugh. Your father tried to cook pancakes over a camp stove in the living room. Burned half of them black as coal. Rebecca gave a small, reluctant smile. He kept insisting they were fine if you just scraped off the burnt parts. Andrew chuckled softly. We ate every one of them anyway. The memory hung in the air like a fragile truce. For the first time that night, there was a sense of shared warmth. But it didn't last long. Rebecca set her bowl aside and looked at Andrew. Why are you here? Her voice wasn't hostile, but it carried an edge. Andrew stiffened. Because I had nowhere else to go. Same as you. Didn't think you'd come to her, she muttered, jerking her head in my direction. Enough, I said quietly, my voice firm. They both looked at me, surprised. This storm isn't the time for more fighting. We've lost too much time already. Rebecca's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. I took a deep breath. I know we've all said things we regret. I know we've all been too stubborn to reach out. But you're both here now. That has to mean something. The words hung there, trembling in the air like the candle flames. Andrew looked away. Rebecca lowered her eyes. The wind howled again, rattling the windows so violently that one of the children stirred in their sleep. Rebecca soothed them with a gentle hand, her face softening as she whispered to them. In that moment, I realized something. We were still a family. Broken, yes, but not beyond repair. And maybe the storm had given us the one thing we had been too proud to give ourselves. A chance to start over. The wind battered the house with relentless force, each gust sounding like it might rip the roof right off. The rain was deafening now, a constant roar that seemed to seep through the walls themselves. I sat back in my chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, watching my 2 children as they silently avoided each other's eyes. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably on the couch, gently pulling a blanket over her children. They had finally fallen into a deeper sleep, their faces peaceful despite the chaos outside. I felt a pang in my heart. How many nights had I missed seeing them like this? How many birthdays, holidays, quiet moments of everyday life had passed me by because of our pride. The candles flickered as the wind howled harder. I glanced at Andrew, who had been staring into the middle distance for what felt like an eternity. His face was drawn, his eyes heavy with thoughts I couldn't guess at. Suddenly, another knock at the door rang out loud, sharp and urgent. We all froze. Andrew shot to his feet, grabbing the flashlight. I stood too, my heart pounding as I moved to the door. When I opened it, the storm burst inside like a living creature, wind whipping through the entryway, rain pelting our faces. There, shivering and wide-eyed, stood Rebecca. But this time she wasn't alone. Her 2 small children clung to her hands, their clothes soaked, their hair plastered to their foreheads. Her eyes locked with mine, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then she said softly, Mom. My throat tightened painfully. Come in, I whispered, stepping aside. She ushered the children in quickly, her body trembling from the cold and the sheer force of the wind outside. Andrew stood there staring at her with something unreadable in his eyes. Becca, he said quietly. She gave a brief nod in his direction, but didn't respond. Instead, she knelt down to help her children out of their wet shoes, murmuring words of comfort to them. The tension in the room was so thick I could almost feel it in my chest. I reached for a blanket and draped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said softly, glancing at me for only a moment before turning her attention back to the children. I poured her a bowl of soup and set it in front of her. She hesitated, then sat down at the table, her hands curled around the bowl as though for warmth, more than hunger. Andrew watched silently, his eyes darting between his sister and me. It struck me then just how long it had been since the three of us had been in the same room together. So much time had passed that they now seemed like strangers in their own childhood home. Rebecca finally broke the silence. The roads were flooding fast. "We had no choice but to come here. You did the right thing," I said gently. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her soup. "I didn't think I'd ever set foot in this house again." My chest tightened at her words, but I forced myself to stay quiet. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. "Guess none of us did." For a moment, Rebecca looked at him. There was something in her expression, something softer than anger, but not yet forgiveness. I took a deep breath. "Whatever brought you here, I'm just glad you're both safe." They didn't answer, but the words seemed to settle in the space between us. Fragile, but real. The wind rattled the windows violently, and the house gave a low, unsettling groan. I glanced upward, worry gnawing at me. "Mom," Andrew said suddenly. "Yes. Do you still have that old generator in the shed?" "Yes, but it hasn't been used in years. We might need it if this storm gets worse," he said grimly. Rebecca looked between us, worry etched across her face. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a decade, my children were under my roof again. And somehow, even with the storm outside threatening to tear everything apart, it felt like the beginning of something new. The storm howled endlessly through the night, a relentless force shaking the house to its core. Every gust of wind made the walls creak and the windows rattle like they were about to shatter. We were trapped, the four of us and the children, confined in a space that felt far too small for all the heavy history we shared. I busied myself with small tasks to fill the silence, refilling the children's cups, with water, tending to the candles, and folding blankets that had already been unfolded and used. Every time I looked up, I caught Andrew and Rebecca exchanging brief, uneasy glances before quickly looking away from each other. The room was heavy with discomfort, as if all the years of anger and absence were sitting with us, uninvited guests, in my living room. When the wind began to die down just slightly, Andrew stood. "I'll check the shed," he said abruptly, grabbing the flashlight. Rebecca frowned. "In this weather, you're going to get yourself killed. We might need that generator." He shot back, his voice harsher than necessary. "Stop it," I said firmly, my voice cutting through their brewing argument. "Andrew, wait until morning. You won't be able to do anything in this storm. Sit down." He hesitated, then reluctantly obeyed, sitting back at the table with his arms crossed tightly. The silence returned, tense and suffocating. Rebecca began to gather the empty bowls. I tried to stop her, but she shook her head. "I can do it," she said quietly. It wasn't much, but it was the first voluntary act of help she'd offered since stepping through my door. Andrew watched her for a moment before finally standing and joining her at the sink. They worked side by side without a word, but I noticed the faintest softening in their posture, the way Andrew handed her the rinsed bowls, how Rebecca didn't flinch when their hands brushed. It was small, so small that it could have been meaningless. But after so many years, even the smallest sign of cooperation felt monumental. The children, now more awake, began whispering to each other, giggling softly at some private joke only siblings their age could understand. Their laughter felt like sunlight breaking through clouds, warming the cold room just a little. I smiled at them, my heart aching with both joy and regret. They didn't know me, not really. I was just a name they might have heard in passing, a grandmother too distant to be real. But tonight, in the dim glow of the candles, they seemed a little less wary. Rebecca caught me watching and gave me a brief, almost sheepish smile before looking away again. Andrew broke the silence this time. "The roads will probably be blocked tomorrow. We'll have to stay here a while." "I know," Rebecca replied softly. The weight of those words settled over us. We would be stuck here together, forced to share the same space, the same air, the same history we had spent years avoiding. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of the storm and the soft, quiet movements of a family rediscovering how to coexist. I found myself thinking of all the years I had spent alone holidays, where I had cooked meals for one birthdays, where I blew out candles by myself. I had told myself I didn't need them, that I could survive on my own. But seeing them here, even in the awkward silence, made me realize how deeply I had missed them. Eventually, I lay down on the couch, pretending to sleep. Through half-closed eyes, I watched as Rebecca adjusted the blankets around her children, then sat down close enough that our shoulders almost touched. Andrew sat at the table, head resting in his hands, his posture finally sagging with exhaustion. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was the first night in 10 years that I wasn't alone. And for now, that was enough. I don't know what time it was when it happened. Perhaps 2, maybe 3 in the morning. The storm outside had not eased. If anything, the wind had grown even more vicious, pounding the house with a rage that felt almost personal. The children had drifted into a deeper sleep, their soft breaths barely audible above the howling wind. Andrew sat slumped in the chair near the table, half asleep, while Rebecca leaned against the couch arm, her head resting in her hand as she watched over her kids. Then, without warning, there was a deafening crack, a sound so loud it felt like the earth itself had split apart. The house jolted violently, and a second later, an enormous crash shook the walls. The children woke instantly, crying in fear. Rebecca grabbed them, pulling them close, her face pale with shock. Andrew leapt to his feet. That was the tree, he shouted over the roar of the wind. I grabbed a flashlight and hurried to the hallway window. Shining the light outside, I saw it. The old oak tree that had stood in our backyard for decades had fallen, its massive trunk now leaning heavily against the roof. "Everyone get away from that side of the house," Andrew ordered, his voice sharp and commanding, in a way I hadn't heard since he was a teenager trying to play the man of the house after his father passed. Rebecca clutched the children as Andrew ushered them toward the opposite side of the living room. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed more blankets and supplies. The roof groaned under the weight of the fallen tree. Water began dripping through the ceiling in thin, steady rivulets. "We have to stay put until morning," Andrew said. "It's too dangerous to go outside now." Rebecca nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. The children buried their faces in her chest, sobbing quietly. I moved closer, placing a steadying hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "We'll be all right," I said softly, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Andrew knelt beside the heater, trying to get it to burn hotter. "It's going to get colder. We need to keep them warm." Without a word, Rebecca began pulling the children closer to the heater, while Andrew dragged over extra blankets. I joined them, and for the first time since they had arrived, the 3 of us moved together without hesitation. The children gradually stopped crying, lulled by our combined efforts to soothe them. Rebecca hummed softly, the same lullaby I used to sing when she was little. The sound nearly broke me in two. Andrew sat back, finally wiping his brow. "Well, at least the walls are still standing," he muttered, a weak attempt at humor. Rebecca actually let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "Still the optimist, huh?" He shrugged. "Someone has to be." It was such a simple exchange, but it carried something profound, a moment of familiarity, of shared memory. For years, they had avoided even being in the same room, let alone speaking to each other. Now, huddled together against the storm, they were finding pieces of the bond they'd thought was lost. I sat quietly, listening to their tentative words. My heart ached with both joy and regret. Joy for the fragile steps they were taking toward each other. Regret for all the years we had wasted. Rebecca eventually looked at me. "Do you remember that time the power went out for 2 days? Dad tried to make pancakes on the camping stove." I laughed, the memory vivid. "He burned every one of them, and you both still insisted on eating them anyway." Andrew chuckled. "We told him they were great." He looked so proud. The 3 of us shared a quiet smile, one of the first genuine ones since they had walked through my door. The storm still raged outside the roof, still groaned under the weight of the fallen tree, and water still dripped steadily from the ceiling. But inside, in that cramped living room, something had shifted. For the first time in a decade, we weren't just surviving the night. We were surviving it together. The night dragged on hour by hour until the darkness outside began to thin just slightly. The storm still raged, but the worst of its fury seemed to have passed. The house was battered and bruised, drips of water from the ceiling, bits of plaster scattered on the floor, but it was still standing. Andrew was the first to move when the gray morning light crept through the broken blinds. He stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his shoulders, and quietly checked the windows. Rebecca was still curled up with the children, her arms protectively around them. They had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep. I sat in my chair, too wired to rest, my eyes fixed on the flickering candle in front of me. The events of the night still felt surreal. After so many years of silence, my children were here under my roof, depending on me once again. When Andrew finally sat back down, I noticed the scrape on his forearm, likely from when he had rushed to steady the heater in the chaos last night. The cut was raw, a thin streak of dried blood on his skin. "Let me see that," I said gently. He glanced at his arm dismissively. "It's fine." "It's not fine," I replied, my tone firmer. I stood, retrieving the old tin first aid kit I kept in the hall closet. "Sit still." He didn't argue this time, just extended his arm toward me. As I cleaned the wound with antiseptic, the years seemed to melt away. It felt like I was back in time, tending to the countless scrapes and bruises of his boyhood soccer injuries, bike crashes, the time he tried to climb the big oak tree and fell halfway down. "You still have that same look on your face," I murmured. "What look?" he asked with a faint smile. "The one that says, 'I'm fine, Mom. Don't fuss over me.'" He chuckled softly. "Guess some things don't change." For the briefest moment it felt normal, familiar, and it made my chest ache in ways I hadn't expected. Rebecca stirred, then blinking in the dim light. She looked at us quietly as I finished bandaging Andrew's arm. Her expression was unreadable, soft, but guarded. "Are you okay?" I asked her. She nodded slowly. "The kids are still asleep." "Thank God." Andrew glanced toward the window. "I'll check outside when the wind calms a bit more. See what we're dealing with." "Not alone," Rebecca said sharply. "You're not just wandering off like that." Andrew looked at her, surprised by her tone. But instead of snapping back, he simply nodded. "Fine. We'll both go." It was such a small thing, yet it felt like progress. I poured what little milk we had left into mugs for the children, setting them on the table for when they woke. Then I sat down again, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Rebecca's eyes followed my movements. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I'm sorry. About last night. About everything." The words hung there, fragile but powerful. Andrew looked at her, his brows furrowing slightly. Rebecca swallowed hard. "I was so angry. I thought you were trying to control me, Mom. I told myself I didn't need you. But last night, I didn't know where else to go. And the first place I thought of was here." My throat tightened. I reached for her hand across the table. To my relief, she didn't pull away. "I never stopped wanting you to come back," I said softly. Her lips trembled. "I know." Andrew looked between us, his own expression heavy with unspoken thoughts. For the first time in 10 years, we weren't avoiding the truth. We weren't pretending that everything was fine or that the past didn't matter. We were finally slowly beginning to face it. Morning came slowly, the storm's rage giving way to a steady cold rain. The sky outside was a dull gray, and the once familiar view of my backyard was unrecognizable. Branches, shingles, and debris littered the ground. The massive oak tree that had fallen in the night leaned precariously against the roof, its heavy trunk threatening to crush the remaining structure if the wind picked up again. Andrew stood by the window, his arms crossed tightly, scanning the yard. "We'll have to get that tree removed before it collapses." "The rest of the roof," he said, his voice edged with practicality. Rebecca was spooning what little oatmeal I had left into bowls for the children. The kids sat quietly at the table, their small voices murmuring questions about when they could go home. "You can't yet, sweethearts," Rebecca said softly, brushing a damp curl from her daughter's forehead. "We need to stay here until it's safe." Andrew turned toward me. "Once the rain lets up, I'll see if I can clear a path to the shed. If the generator still works, we'll have power for at least a few essentials, eh?" "Don't go alone," Rebecca said sharply, surprising me again with her tone. Andrew blinked at her, clearly caught off guard, but then he simply nodded. Fine. We'll both go. That brief exchange, the simple cooperation, the absence of hostility was almost surreal. These were my children, the ones who hadn't been able to stand being in the same room for a decade now, speaking like allies rather than enemies. I placed a bowl of oatmeal in front of Andrew and sat down at the table with my own. You two were always the most stubborn kids in town, I said softly, my lips curling into a small smile. Neither of you would ever admit when you were wrong. Rebecca glanced at me, a wry expression tugging at her lips. Guess we got that from you. Her words might have stung once, but now they just made me laugh softly. Maybe you did. For a while we ate in silence. The only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. But the silence wasn't as heavy as before. It felt different now, less like a wall, more like the cautious calm after a storm. After breakfast, Rebecca began clearing the table. Andrew joined her without being asked, and the two of them worked side by side like they used to when they were younger, back when chores were just chores, not battlegrounds. Watching them, something inside me loosened. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. Rebecca turned to me as she dried her hands on a towel. Mom, about everything that happened, I know I hurt you. I thought I was doing what was best for me, but I didn't realize how much I was shutting you out. I told myself you didn't care, but deep down, I think I just didn't want to face how much I cared. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. Andrew shifted uncomfortably, as if her words struck something in him too. I reached across the table, taking her hand. We've all been too proud for too long, I said softly. I've missed so much, but I never stopped loving either of you. Rebecca's lips trembled as she nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Andrew cleared his throat, his voice rough when he finally spoke. I didn't call either. I told myself it wasn't my job to fix things, but maybe I just didn't want to admit that I was wrong too. The words hung in the air, fragile but powerful. I squeezed both their hands. It doesn't matter whose fault it was anymore. We can't get those years back. But we can decide what we do with the ones we still have. For the first time since that awful night 10 years ago, both my children looked at me, really looked at me, not with anger, not with resentment, but with the beginnings of something that looked like understanding. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a start, and that for now was enough. The rain outside softened to a steady drizzle, and for the first time since the storm began, the sky seemed to lighten just a little. The house was quiet now. The children played on the floor with an old set of wooden blocks I had kept in the closet all these years, their soft laughter filling the room like music I hadn't heard in far too long. Rebecca sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea I'd brewed from the last of my supplies. She stared down at the steam curling upward as if gathering the courage to speak. Andrew was at the window again, watching the yard and muttering about the damage, his fingers drumming anxiously on the sill. Finally, Rebecca looked up at me. Her voice was quiet but clear. Mom, I need to say this. I froze, my heart pounding as I met her eyes. I'm sorry, she said, her voice trembling. For everything. For leaving the way I did. For the things I said to you that night. I told myself I didn't care if I hurt you, that I was just defending myself. But the truth is, I've regretted it for years. Andrew turned from the window, his brow furrowed as he watched her. Rebecca's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't look away. I was angry, but I didn't want to admit how much I still wanted you in my life. I told myself you were better off without me. That lie was easier than admitting I missed you. Her voice cracked, and she wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand. I missed you so much, Mom. But I didn't know how to come back. My throat tightened painfully. I reached across the table, my hands closing over hers. I missed you too, Becca. Every single day. I never stopped loving you. Not for 1 second. She broke then, her shoulders trembling as she let out a sob she'd clearly been holding back for years. Andrew stepped forward, hesitating before resting a hand on her shoulder. You weren't the only one, he said quietly. I told myself I was being loyal to you, Becca, by cutting her off too. But it was just easier than admitting I didn't want to lose either of you. Rebecca turned to him, her tear-streaked face softening. We wasted so much time? Andrew nodded. Yeah, we did. I squeezed both their hands. We can't undo the past. But maybe we can start again. Rebecca nodded, tears still falling silently down her cheeks. Andrew took a deep breath, his eyes glistening too. I should have called. I should have visited. I just didn't know how to come back either. The three of us sat there in silence for a long moment, the weight of the years pressing down, but beginning to lift just a little. Rebecca finally reached across the table, taking my other hand. I don't want to lose more time, she said softly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Andrew sat down, resting his hand over both of ours. Neither do I. The children laughed again as their tower of blocks toppled over their giggles, breaking the heavy silence in the best way possible. I looked at them, my grandchildren, and felt a spark of hope I hadn't dared believe in for years. Maybe this storm hadn't just destroyed things. Maybe it had given us a chance to rebuild not just the house, but the family we'd thought was lost forever. The rain tapered off as afternoon approached, leaving behind an eerie quiet. The world outside looked like it had been torn apart. Fallen branches, debris scattered across the yard, and the massive oak tree still leaning heavily on the roof. Yet inside there was a fragile peace settling between us like the air right after a storm breaks. Rebecca wiped her eyes, still holding one of my hands. Andrew sat across from us, his face unreadable, but softer than I had seen it in years. I want you to know my side of things, I said quietly. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to continue. I never wanted to control you, Becca. I was scared for you. I worried you were rushing into something you'd regret, but I went about it the wrong way. And I hurt you. I know that now. Rebecca's lips pressed into a thin line as she nodded. I know. I think. I knew it even then. I just didn't want to admit you might have been right about some things. I wanted to prove I didn't need you anymore. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I was angry at you too, Mom. But I think I just wanted a reason to feel like I was protecting Becca. It was easier than realizing we were both just too proud to back down. I took a deep breath. You were both so grown up that night, and yet still my children in every way. I thought if I waited long enough, you'd come back. But then months turned into years, and I didn't know how to reach out anymore, without feeling like I was begging for scraps of your time. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears again. I should have called you. I should have let the kids know their grandmother. But every time I thought about it, my pride stopped me. It felt easier to pretend you didn't care. My lips trembled into a faint smile. I cared every day. There wasn't a single day I didn't think about you both. Andrew finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I think I just wanted someone to blame. Dad's death. The tension in the family, it was easier to be angry at you than to admit I didn't know how to deal with any of it. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, the weight of honesty pressing down, but also setting us free. Rebecca looked at me, her voice breaking. I want to make this right, Mom. I don't want to keep living like strangers anymore. Andrew nodded, his eyes glistening. Neither do I. I reached for both their hands again, my heart aching with both relief and regret. We can't undo the past, but we can choose what happens from here. Rebecca glanced at her children who were playing quietly with the blocks on the floor. They deserve to know you. I want them to know you. Her words hit me harder than I expected. My chest ached, but in a way that felt like something inside me was healing slowly but surely. Andrew exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. I'll help fix the roof. We'll get this place back in shape. It's the least I can do. I smiled faintly at him. You don't have to. I want to, he interrupted gently. The three of us stayed like that, holding on to each other in a way we hadn't for years. It wasn't forgiveness yet. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was honest, and that was more than I'd dared to hope for. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and the faintest rays of sunlight broke through, illuminating the wet yard in a soft, golden glow. It felt symbolic, like maybe the worst had finally passed. By late afternoon, the rain had stopped completely. The air outside was heavy and damp, but the oppressive roar of the storm was gone. Through the window, I could see neighbors slowly emerging from their homes, stepping cautiously through puddles and fallen branches to check on each other. Andrew stood by the door holding the flashlight even though daylight had returned. I'll check the shed, he said. If the generator still works, we can get some lights on tonight. I'll come with you, Rebecca said. Her tone was different now, firmer but not hostile. He raised an eyebrow, but then nodded. All right. I watched as they both slipped on their coats and boots. There was something surreal about seeing them cooperate even in such a small way. While they were outside, I busied myself cleaning the living room. I wiped up the puddles from last night, stacked the bowls in the sink, and tried to restore a sense of normalcy. The children followed me around, their little hands helping pick up blocks and fold blankets, giggling when they managed to help Grandma. The word made my heart swell. I hadn't heard it in so long. Through the window, I could see Andrew and Rebecca dragging a few broken branches away from the shed door. Andrew tested the lock, kicked it lightly, then finally wrenched it open. They disappeared inside together, and for a brief moment I let myself hope. When they returned, Andrew was carrying the old generator. Still works, he said with a faint smile. Rebecca helped him set it up, and after a few sputtering tries, the small machine roared to life. The faint glow of a single lamp lit the living room, and the children cheered. Feels like civilization again, Andrew joked, shaking his head. Rebecca chuckled softly. It's something. For the next hour, we all worked together without words. Andrew and I patched the spots on the ceiling where water had dripped through. Rebecca swept the floor, her children carrying the little dustpan with pride. It felt almost domestic, ordinary even. At one point, I caught Andrew glancing at me. You kept everything, he said, looking around the room. I couldn't bring myself to change it, I admitted. His expression softened. I'm glad you didn't. Rebecca wiped her hands on a towel and stood next to him. Me too, she said quietly. I looked at the two of them, my grown children, side by side, working together in a way I hadn't seen in years. The sight filled me with a sense of quiet, overwhelming relief. By the time the sun began to set, we had made real progress. The living room looked less chaotic, the children had been fed, and we were finally able to breathe without the sound of wind shaking the house. We sat down to eat the last of the bread and canned soup. It wasn't much, but it felt like a feast. Rebecca looked at me as she held her mug of tea. I think we all needed this, just not in the way it happened. Andrew smirked. Guess the storm forced us to finally talk. I smiled softly. Sometimes life doesn't give us the gentle version of what we need. It just gives us what we need. For a while, we just sat together quietly eating, listening to the generator's hum. The house felt different now, warmer, lighter, like it was slowly breathing again after being closed off for so long. We hadn't solved everything. We hadn't undone the past. But we were together, and that was more than I could have asked for. The next morning, the world outside looked completely changed. The sky was bright as if the storm had never happened, but the neighborhood bore its scars: fallen trees, scattered debris, power lines sagging dangerously close to the ground. Yet inside my house, something else had shifted. Something I hadn't dared hope for in years. Rebecca was in the kitchen helping the children eat their breakfast. Andrew stood by the window again, but this time he wasn't looking out with that distant, guarded expression. He was watching the kids, a faint smile on his face. When I joined them, Rebecca looked up. We should help you clean up today. We can't leave things like this for you to handle alone. You don't have to, I began, but she shook her head firmly. We want to, she said simply. For the rest of the morning, we worked together. Andrew cleared branches from the yard, while Rebecca helped me mop up the last of the water that had leaked inside. The children collected small sticks and leaves, pretending they were helping with the big job. Their giggles rang through the air like music I had thought I'd never hear again. When we finally stopped to rest, Rebecca sat beside me on the porch steps. Her hands were raw from the cleanup, but her expression was softer than I'd seen it in years. Mom, she said quietly, I don't want things to go back to how they were. I don't want to lose you again. I felt my chest tighten, tears threatening to spill over. Then don't, I said simply. Andrew joined us, wiping sweat from his brow. We'll be around more. I promise. We can't get back those years, but we can make up for some of it. For a moment, the three of us just sat there side by side. The children played in the yard. Their laughter carried on the breeze. It wasn't perfect. We still had years of hurt to sift through, things to forgive, and wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But there was hope now, a fragile, precious hope that felt like the sun breaking through clouds after days of darkness. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived in the mail. Inside was a single photo: Rebecca, Andrew, and the children standing together and smiling. On the back, written in Rebecca's familiar handwriting, were 5 simple words: "We're not leaving again." I held the photo in my hands, my heart swelling with gratitude. After a decade of silence, my family had come back to me, not because of perfect timing or the right words, but because life had stripped away everything but what truly mattered. Sometimes it takes a storm to remind us of what we should never have let go. And this time, I knew we wouldn't let it slip away again. It has been months since the hurricane, but the memories of that night still sit vividly in my mind. The howling wind, the fear, the deafening crash of the oak tree against the roof. And yet, what lingers most isn't the destruction. It's the way my children looked at me for the first time in 10 years. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with something that felt like recognition. The house has been repaired now. The roof is new. The windows replaced. But the most profound changes can't be seen in wood and nails. They live in the sound of my grandchildren laughing in the yard every weekend, in the way Rebecca calls me just to tell me about her day, in the way Andrew stops by after work to have dinner with me. I still grieve the time we lost. I still regret the years we spent in silence, the birthdays and holidays that passed without us sharing them. But regret isn't all that's left anymore. What we have now is choice. A choice to show up, to forgive, to be present. The hurricane destroyed so much, but it also gave us something priceless: another chance. And that chance is something I will never take for granted again. To anyone who has let pride or pain keep them from the people they love, life is too short. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves only trap us inside our own loneliness. Don't wait for a storm to remind you what really matters. If this story has touched you, share it with someone who might need the reminder. And tell me, have you ever mended something you thought was broken forever?